Quad 6.6, more data. Okay, so this is part 2. In this video, we're going to be talking about motor responsiveness. And I think this video is still, so like the other video, this is going to be kind of a primer where, although I'm going to talk about some results here for the 1204 to 1303 motors, the big thing here is explaining what we're looking for and why we did what we did and how we're reporting out these results. But this data, this is where I think Carl Pablo's bringing some really new data into the micro world, because we haven't seen this, at least I haven't seen this kind of stuff out there yet. We've seen the static stuff, efficiency and thrust, but what we want to also know is how well, not just like when the motor's at a certain throttle point, how well does it do there? We want to know how quickly it gets to that throttle point, and we also want to know when the PID controller is going ahead and trying to adjust the throttle on the motor, how well is that motor going to respond to the PID controller, and therefore how well is it going to handle. So what we did, my first go around, like the strategy I kind of mapped out, or that we mapped out together in terms of like how to test these motors, didn't actually work out very well, because what we found is that once the motors are spun up, like once you're at 50% throttle, if you're going to 50 to 75 or something like that, they all basically do the same thing within measurement errors. Basically once it's spun up, all the motors respond just fine, as long as you're comparing like fairly similar motors. Where we found the big differences were down at the lower throttle responses, particularly down into so in this particular motor, this is like 10% throttle bumping up to 25, 10 to 50, and I think that's 10 to 75. And what we found is the differences are really much more dramatic down at the lower throttle responses. And so ultimately what we decided on was 2 tests, because I didn't want to just totally focus on the low ends and say, okay, maybe that biases the results to some degree. But what we ended up with is going a jump from 10 to 30% and a jump from 10 to 60% throttle. We cut out anything where you started at like 50% bumped up, because those were just, it didn't add any data, it just added more runs. The other thing we did to make the data super consistent is that when Carl Pablo wrote up the script, he actually repeated these runs 100 times per motor. So bumping up 10 to 30% over and over 100 times to get really consistent data, and then 10 to 60%. And I believe what he finally settled on was 100 runs total. It's going to be, I'm also going to link to his blog or his website, so you can see the data over there too. So then one of the other things we consider too is like, how do you not penalize motors that, for example, if it's a higher kV or a taller stator motor, what if, so pretend these aren't, pretend that this is like different motors instead of the same one, but what if one motor only jumps a little bit versus another motor, and this motor takes a little bit longer? Do you really want to penalize this motor versus the motor with the narrow response? And that's ultimately, so if initially we're kind of looking at response time. So how long does the motor take to go from the baseline up to the upper throttle point? And we're looking at the time, but we didn't want to penalize the higher performing motors, the ones that had the bigger jumps. And so what we ultimately did is what I ultimately wanted to look at was the response rate. So effectively looking at the slope of this jump. And this is a little bit of a complicated thing to look at, so I just zoomed in here on one response, because so the initial part of that is actually pretty easy to pick up. You can see most of these things, like once the motor kicks, it jumps up pretty quick. When exactly it kicks after you give that response, there's a little variability there. And then the harder part is up top, because it's not such a crisp, L-shaped up here. It's kind of more of a curve. It's a little bit of a sigmoid up there. And so depending on how you set your kind of like endpoint detection, can have a little bit of variability. But ultimately I think we have something that's at least very reproducible, and that's what we're reporting out. And so in terms of responsiveness, then mainly what we're focusing on is how steep is this curve. The steeper the curve, the better, and then that normalizes so you can compare a motor that's wider, shorter, stator, lower kV, that's not going to jump up as high, to a motor that does have that taller stator and has the higher kV and is going to jump up higher. And so if we look at these slopes, that's kind of like an apples to apples comparison. So that's what we're going to look at here. I'm going to jump over to RStudio, and so this is where I just kind of made a chart And in this case now, so this is the response rate. So this is the change in RPM per millisecond. And this is again for those motors that we've looked at. So we've got the FPV cycle 1303, GEP RC 1204, the Jing 1204, Power Drone 1204.5, Power Drone 1303.5, and the T-Motor 1303. And so the dark blue condition, this is that lower throttle step, so this is 10 to 30%. And the lighter blue is the 10 to 60% condition. And I stacked them this way so you could see the total, the overall gist of it. As I said, there's more differences down here at this lower throttle step than at the higher one. But if we add them together, you can kind of see, kind of pick your winners and losers. So on this one, because this is response rate, the taller this is, the better. We want more change in RPM per millisecond. So the taller, the better on these. And from looking at the taller, basically we can see right off our winner, Power Drone 1204.5 motor. It's a little bit more motor, and that kind of makes sense. But it's also, when we look at these, I think the 1303 to some degree, not, T-Motor does pretty well, but the 1303s kind of maybe underperform a little bit in response compared to the 1204s, which is kind of interesting because the idea that was at least put out there was let's go to these wider motors because they can generate more torque and therefore you're going to get better responsiveness and you're going to handle the props better. And I don't think that that is really what's going on. And to some degree, I've found that like the motors with bigger punch, I think they're a little easier to tune the PID for me anyways. I think so. I don't know. Maybe I could be making that up and projecting here. But I think what's happening when people are thinking that the motors with the wider stators are like control the throttle better, I think it might be because it's actually just a throttle range. The amount of throttle that you get out of any given step is probably less, so it feels easier to control, even though it's like it's probably a little mushy, so that people who like kind of a softer, more cinematic, more juicy kind of response are probably, you might like the wider motors, but people who just want, and this is me, I want my motor to do as much as it possibly can when I tell it to do it. For me, for my flying style, I think I prefer these taller motors, higher kV motors that are going to have the bigger response rate. Okay, so as far as whether or not that's true, I haven't really flown these size motors enough to know if what I think I want to feel in air correlates with this, but I am going to do that with the 1103 motors. And so when we get those results, I'll be able to cross-correlate that really well with my experiences in the air. But that's my theory, is that I think what we want to see is the higher response rate. I think that's going to give the PID better authority. That PID, it's going to be more responsive to the PID controller, and I think it's going to give you more authority to the prop. And as long as you can handle the amount of thrust that it has, I think the throttle is going to be more precise. All right, so that's the data here. We're going to do one more video. In the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to actually look at the motor parameters and see how they correlate with these different things that we looked at in terms of thrust efficiency and motor responsiveness, see if we can pick anything out. Because I think the more interesting question is going to be like, okay, what about the motors? So yeah, so the Power Drone motor, is it more motor? Is it the geometry of the motor? Is it the KV? What kind of things are going to predict this responsiveness? What kind of things are going to predict the thrust, the efficiency? And I think we can get into some really interesting questions. For these, we may not have quite as many motors as I want. The next test, we've got more motors, plus we can combine those in, and then we've got a broader range of motors. So like now, if we're looking at 1103s to 1103, 1202, 1203, 1204, 1303, we'll have much more numbers that we can look at, and it'll help the analysis. But I'm just excited to get started here. And again, this was supposed to be more of a primer video, but a little treat of some results for you. And I'd be really curious, please respond back with your impressions of these motors and whether what you feel in the air correlates with what we're seeing in the thrust data. Okay, until next time, cheers.